Oh, no, it's okay. All right, so shifting perspectives of nature. I'm going to do a little bit of a combination for this one and read parts of the essay. And I also have the slideshow. And if it works, I'd like to play a clip from the movie Akira. A little bit graphic in terms of just kind of weird organic stuff. It's anime, so just be prepared. Here we go. So we're talking about the Anthropocene in this essay, and it's sort of been the subtext of this conference, this whole idea of humanity and nature, and our shifting perspective of nature, and how, for me anyway, it's the question of the Anthropocene and how the Anthropocene changes that relationship and that dynamic. This is Eugene Stormer, who's one of the coiners of this phrase, Anthropocene. I was at a conference where someone said something about the Holocene, which is sort of what we were going for, the human age, the human period. I suddenly thought this was wrong. The world had changed too much. So I said, no, we're in the Anthropocene. And I'll read a little bit from my essay at this point. Tim Morton, who was also mentioned during this conference, wrote, "The Anthropocene doesn't destroy nature. The Anthropocene is nature in its toxic nightmare form. Nature is the latent form of the Anthropocene waiting to emerge as catastrophe." So the term Anthropocene was coined independently by Eugene Stormer and Paul Crutzen, and although ultimately popularized by Paul in the 1980s, it is Eugene's succinct and cryptic statement, "The world has changed too much," which hauntingly lingers in the mind. When I first encountered the term Anthropocene, I was at first perplexed by the need to draw lines in the sand to structure an age that we're living in this certain way, and naming it after ourselves. The age of humanity. Aren't we supposed to be getting past that? Aren't we supposed to be doing the non-human term? But we are already, the structure of our age is already quite literally, with every sip of 7-Eleven coffee and gas-guzzling joyride we take to the park, it is a human age. It is no longer a question of the West or industrial civilization. We've already swallowed up the Earth's ecosystems within ourselves, insofar as there's nowhere you can go on the planet, and this is also a technical definition of the Anthropocene, that hasn't been affected by our collective activities. There's no such thing as pristine nature. Even in a pristine place where no human has been in 1,000 years, the effect of CO2 in the atmosphere, carbon, is still affecting those places and changing the global climate and the temperature and that sort of thing. So there's nowhere you can go that's outside of human civilization anymore, in that sense. Yeah, the planet has our stink, as it were, and we have extended our activities so exponentially as to become a geological and atmospheric force, one working definition we can apply. So this is the interesting thing, where suddenly human activity is becoming non-human in its massiveness, in its exponentialness. Let's see what the... So... Yeah, the word's technical meaning refers to the geological impact human beings have on the Earth. Future paleontologists from some distant world, or an artificial intelligence as depicted in Spielberg's AI, could mark the arrival of our species in the geological record as an event. More precisely, an extinction event. Something like the meteor that impacted the Gulf of Mexico roughly 65 million years ago. We know the scientific consensus. Unless we act now, and act radically, we won't be able to stop the rapid climb of global temperature. It is fiction, rather than climate data, that I believe anyway, offers us tangible narratives about this tremendous upheaval of human society. Fiction is the cultural imaginary of civilization. It reflects back to us our psychological mutation, subtly shaping and announcing some new structure of consciousness, some new attempt to leap forth with integrative creative powers and say yes to crisis, and therefore yes to our time and its predicaments, even the Anthropocene. John Gebser demonstrated how philosophical revolutions and world-turning hypotheses can be spun in a work of art preceding or coinciding with syncretic transformations in philosophy, mathematics, and science. The Anthropocene is no different, and as John Gebser consistently also noted, when we do not embrace the age embraces us, perhaps like Rilke's terrifying angels. Similarly, historian William Irwin Thompson suggests that evil enunciates the New World Order. And Michael Purdy, your description of the efficient and deficient being sort of no longer helpful in our age is very good here, because in many ways, as I'm going to be talking about, there's a lot of interesting developments, hopeful things, but there's also a lot of things where it's kind of a nightmare form of the integral. And it's a strange, kind of bizarre thing, but I'll get into it. I would like to suggest that the Anthropocene, its presence both as geological and cultural reality, marks a leap from the convenient bifurcations of nature and culture into some stranger, uncanny reality. Let me be even more cryptic. The Anthropocene reintroduces us to the non-human world, where even the structures of consciousness appear to be reconstituted into a larger wearing of the whole, and the very notion of the human world is rendered transparent to and co-constituted with non-human presences, agencies, and the odd paradox of the non-human in humans themselves. This world, though it is a scary one, separations between nature and culture, self and world, subject and object, natural and artificial, all become slippery, they get weird. None of our definitions survive this leap, as the fictions in this age reveal to us, but let's hope we do. We meet ourselves on the other side. Okay, so the first story I'd like to bring up is one of my favorite books in 2015, William Gibson's The Peripheral. And it plays with very interesting concepts, not only about nature and culture, but also, interestingly, about time, as science fiction is often doing. But so William Gibson's 2015 novel, The Peripheral, examines themes concordant with an integral a perception of time. In the future, scientists discover a form of time travel by way of information sent across advanced computers. In a dark fashion to be expected by cyberpunk's originator, Gibson imagines a form of trans-temporal colonialism whereby the future exploits the past for its own amusement, manipulating its stocks, buying and selling as politicians, and playing games of war. Okay, so this future happens after something that they call the jackpot. And this is the part that's interesting and relevant to the Anthropocene. The jackpot is the Anthropocene, an ironic descriptor for the aggregate of climate catastrophe, ecological collapse, and economic revolution that would fill the mid-21st century, leaving only a few 100 million humans alive at the other side of it. And the human beings on the other side of the jackpot are quite different from us. The advancements in biology and cybernetics have revolutionized the body, permitting anyone to experience being in any body, human or non-human, by projecting their consciousness into peripherals. In this future, London is quiet, too quiet, a ghost city, where the city still bustles about, but it is filled with peripherals and androids wandering about and reenacting particular histories, all kind of cobbled together in different periods, Victorian, medieval, etc. I see, I believe I have an interesting quote here, and this is Gibson actually commenting on this concept of an apocalypse versus sort of the harder to understand events that are bigger, that are more systemic, that are more perhaps, in Gebser's term, there's a kind of synerasis in this sort of distributed series of events that are difficult to kind of pinpoint and say, this is the apocalypse, this is the transformation, this is the collapse. So, yeah, the idea of an abrupt apocalypse is something that our culture is attached to, but really, would it look like that? Yeah, so this is also a bit from the book, quoting it in an article, a progress accompanied by constant violence, by sufferings unimaginable. This cumulative apocalypse distributes the future so unevenly that 80% of the world's population, Neverton and Flinger characters. Interestingly, he uses the term androgenic disasters in the book. There's an interesting term, androgenic. Everything else tangled in the changing climate, droughts, water shortages, crop failures, honeybees gone, like they almost were now, collapse of the other keystone species, every last alpha predator gone, antibiotics doing even less than they already did, diseases that were never quite the big pandemic, but just big enough to be historic events. And we kind of, if you read this, you kind of know this is already happening. We're already seeing these kinds of events that are setting, heat records every year, or something's going on that's very destabilizing. And us in the middle of it, we don't see it as an event. We don't see ourselves in a kind of historical transition period. But this is what they're like when you're actually, So this is just sort of an example of how fiction can help us start thinking differently in a way that's more complicated, complex, and actually enable us to perceive what's happening, rather than look for some singular event to say this is the Anthropocene. So this is the part where I kind of go into a little bit of philosophy to help describe. There's also another interesting turn in the humanities, the concept of the hyperobject, and I'll just read here. The Anthropocene heralds the arrival of the hyperobject, a term introduced by Tim Morton and utilized in object-oriented ontology. First, a definition of objects. The shifting attention out of crisis to ecological systems has planted an incipient awareness of the non-human world. Some of these organisms live inside us symbiotically in the biota of our gut, or macroscopically in the organism of Gaia, in which we suddenly find kinship with the microcosm, as Lynn Margulis has pointed out to us. Ecological consciousness nudges our species back into the non-human world, into the uncanny gaze of many-eyed organisms. Object-oriented ontology recognizes agency in the tree frog or the fire ant or even the fern, but it goes further in suggesting that anything, any object, has a kind of irreducible agency, and our ability to know these objects, the smallest flea, like William Blake's flea, is never exhausted. Objects in nature, if I might lend my own definition to object-oriented ontology, is contrary to Heidegger's concept of the standing reserve. They're not just things that we can break down and then utilize for our own benefit. Rather, it's more of what he described as a poesis. Not a challenging force of nature, but a kind of participation with nature, similar to what Owen Barfield describes as a kind of final participation.
Original participation?
Final participation. He had two terms, original participation and final, very similar to John Gebser. Also influenced by Rudolf Steiner for that. So in this definition, nature is inexhaustible, irreducible, and only yields some of its secrets to us. Each thing is a singularity of which we catch only the warping light at its rim. So, indeed, everything's something like Doctor Who's TARDIS. And I actually think I do have an image of that. Yeah. Where it's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And if we begin to see nature this way, even the smallest organism, even the biota in our gut, the series of relationships and complexities, and even the smallest thing, not only mentally, but also as a kind of shift in perspective, a shift in consciousness, sort of opens up the numinous again to us, if we would be so inclined. Let's see if I have any. Yeah, object-oriented ontology holds that things exist in a profoundly withdrawn way. They cannot be splayed open and totally grasped by anything whatsoever, including themselves. You can't know a thing fully by thinking it, or eating it, or by measuring it, or by painting it. This means that the way things affect one another, causality, cannot be direct, mechanical, but rather indirect or vicarious. Causality is aesthetic. Appreciated that from Tim Morton, describing it in one of his YouTube videos. And some more examples: megacities, climate change, dark matter, ecosystems, human brain, Anthropocene. All of a sudden, we have all of these vast, complex systems that are just showing up in our reality, in our consciousness, in front of us. Non-human entities.
I would add big data.
Big data, it's great. And the internet, I forgot to put that in there too. And that kind of leads me to an interesting observation here with the Anthropocene, which is that, something like an ecological system could be a hyperobject, this kind of interrelated relationship, but so can the internet, and so can a city. So what is it about things that are seemingly artificial and things that are seemingly organic and natural displaying these same principles of nature? Well, that to be an interesting question and something to just hold in our minds. So Tim Morton goes further to sort of explore this concept of hyperobject. The art of the time of hyperobject is an art that explores the uncanniness of beings, the uniqueness of beings, the irony of interrelationships between beings. Art that explores hyperobjects appears spontaneously within contemporary art. Human artists did nothing to make them appear. So again, it's this idea that these objects, these beings, were not, the non-human turn is sort of a confrontation and experience of the other, again, showing up within us. This is just an image of a Michael Wolff's photography of mega cities in China. Interesting side note. These are just a few little things. I'm not really going to go into them. But I already mentioned the non-human turn. Also in the Humanities, In the Dust of This Planet by Eugene Thacker talks about the horror of philosophy and sort of the limits of the mental rational to really, to grok reality. But also horror itself is a kind of way to think about the limits of the known, and another way to kind of encounter things, perhaps through a gnosis or a mysticism. And he kind of compares global versus planetary, which I think is an interesting, whole other conversation. But Gebser talks about this is in the chapter about the humanities, where he's describing these kind of tendencies to look for in emergent disciplines, the consideration of time, the supersession of dualism, and a tendency towards irrationality. I think some of these things I mentioned, including object-oriented ontology in the humanities and non-human turn, as well as the Anthropocene, are all kind of exploring each of these things in their own way. Okay, so this is where it gets kind of fun. So this is one of my, this is another book that I'll be kind of exploring with you here. This is Jeff Vandermeer Southern Reach Trilogy. So continuing our examination of literature in the Anthropocene, we might look at the weird literature movement, also known as weird ecology, which implicitly recognizes the uncanniness with objects of the Anthropocene. Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach Trilogy gets this new insight on nature profoundly, taking place in some near future. Something odd has occurred. A strip of wildlife on a planet somewhere near Florida, and he's actually he lives in Florida as well. So I found that to be interesting, his kind of intuitiveness with the uncanniness of nature and the kind of hostility of the nature as you're describing and the environment there. Somewhere on the planet near Florida has been infected with a strange contagion. It has been dubbed Area X. Teams of scientists go in, but most never return. No one is quite sure how you even get into Area X, as the branch of government in charge of its containment keeps that secret. Those who do return simply appear somewhere stateside, not sure how they got there. Reports from Area X describe bizarre biology, uncanny animals, and even the body horror-inducing transformation of science teams themselves. What's more, Area X seems to be expanding. It is full of strange objects, entities that defy scientific graphibility and seem to have a kind of non-human sentience about themselves. The dolphin with the piercing, uncanny eye swimming in fresh water upstream, moss mounds claiming the semblance of people, strange life forms that crawled out from the sea and claimed the lives of the previous research team at an abandoned lighthouse. I think I have a few images here. So yeah, the strange inverted tower, which nobody built, but which is nevertheless there. It isn't really a tower at all, but an underground spire. And in this tower, too, are strange colonies of life forms on the wall that seem to grow words, strings of words that don't quite form up to meaningful sentences, written by a creature the protagonist can only call the crawler. And the crawler itself was, or perhaps still is, a person. There's a kind of strangeness in the writing. It's very much like this, where you, as a reader, you kind of all of a sudden feel everything is kind of weird. Everything is capable of this kind of weirdness, this twist, as we were talking about in one of the earlier talks. Everything about this place melts down the sense of the containable, knowable world. It isn't the kind of nature we thought it was, and no scientific instrument can tell much about what's happening. Team members are becoming infected by Area X and transforming into things, mirroring the odd fusion going on, I believe, between nature and human nature and the Anthropocene. Suddenly, the Anthropocene is this non-human geological impact on humans, created by humans, which is a natural force, but it's also not a natural force. So it doesn't make sense. It goes in a loop. It twists. It completely destroys our kind of safe, binaries here. There's something also alluring to the place, wearing down the mental stability of the expedition, and when it comes to the protagonist in the first book, flooding her with a strange, vivid euphoria, an uncanny belonging. There's a strangeness, but she feels completely captivated by the strangeness. There's an intimacy with this other, even though she can't say she's ever been there before, she feels like she has. She's going to her childhood, thinking of memories of one of the scenes, this sort of vivid description of a pool in her backyard that had become overgrown with algae and frogs and tadpoles and bugs. And she suddenly feels, as if this is the most intimate part of her, and being in this strange, dangerous place. She feels connected and allured and drawn almost to stay there, despite its dangers. Towards the end of the novel, Annihilation, we learn that Area X has had more expeditions than what the protagonist was told, going perhaps years, maybe decades, and that Area X, as I mentioned before, is expanding. One day, the whole world might become weird like this place, and in some way, the protagonist doesn't wish to fight that. The world, of course, is already weird, and if this essay has made that message clear enough, Area X is already our world, and we are remiss to distract ourselves from the uncanny, truly unknowable nature of a single organism tossing effervescently in a tidal pool. And this is just such a beautiful passage, I wanted to share it. This is from the book. And this is actually not in Area X. She's just somewhere on the northwestern coast doing, she's a former biologist doing a science experiment studying this starfish. And she kind of stumbles into this pool by the ocean in the middle of the night. And she says, what I found when I finally stood there, hands on bent knees, peering down into that tidal pool, was a rare species of colossal starfish, 6-armed, larger than a saucepan, that bled a dark gold color into the still water as if it were on fire. Most of us professionals eschewed the scientific name for a more apt destroyer of worlds. It was covered in thick spines, and along the edges I could see fringed with emerald green, the most delicate of transparent cilia, thousands of them propelling it along its appointed route as it searched for its prey, other lesser starfish. I had never seen a destroyer of worlds before, even in an aquarium. It was so unexpected that I forgot about the slippery rock, and shifting my balance almost fell, steadying myself with one arm propped against the edge of the tidal pool. But the longer I stared at it, the less comprehensible the creature became, the more it became something alien to me. The more I had a sense that I knew nothing at all about nature, about ecosystems. There was something about my mood and its dark glow that eclipsed sense, that made me see this creature, which had indeed been assigned a place in the taxonomy, cataloged, studied, and described, irreducible down to any of that. And if I kept looking, I knew that ultimately I would have to admit I knew less than nothing about myself as well, whether that was a lie or a truth. When I finally wrenched my gaze from the starfish and stood again, I could not tell where the sky met the sea, where I faced the water or the shore. I was completely adrift, dislocated, and I had to navigate by in that moment the glowing beacon below me. So I felt this sort of captured everything that Tim Morton is describing in this kind of uncanny loop between the Anthropocene, between humans and nature, artificial, or just simply just what is reality? What are we perceiving here? And we're kind of mixed up in it where we don't even really know ourselves. There's an uncanniness of what we are. It's not so much that there's nature out there, which is a little strange, but we get civilization, we get culture, we get history, we know what humans are and what we like. No, there's an uncanniness, there's an unknowableness to ourselves as well. Okay, so how am I doing on time?
I lost my phone.
You're fine.
Keep going.
Okay. All right. So last part. I don't know if I'm able to play the film or not at all, but okay. So Akira is the last example, and this one kind of shifts out of ecology and looks at a story that is pretty much all taking place in civilization. It takes place in Neo-Tokyo, which is this mega city of the future that happens after World War III. Akira is a manga, and it also became a very popular anime movie in the 1980s. As it kind of set the precedent for cyberpunk and that kind of thing, that kind of aesthetic, very technological aesthetic. And it kind of opens with this scene of Tokyo getting hit by what looks like an atomic bomb. And I'm not sure if that is an atomic bomb or not, but there's going to be, it's a singularity at any rate. And now we have Neo-Tokyo, which is this, interestingly enough, an image that you might imagine, in our century, a waterlogged, previously, established older city, which is now trying to adapt and survive to the rising sea levels and so forth. But I'll read this part of Akira. In Akira, just about everything is a human environment. Neo-Tokyo is the background and the foreground, a sprawl and a looming mountain of metal and neon lights. Technology reaches its zenith point in the totalization of human environment before a singularity, an eruption of consciousness takes place. And this new consciousness, this psychic mutation, is an intensification. The film itself refers to the idea that a leap has taken place in the evolution of life through the human organism and analogizes a bacteria gaining the powers of the human mind. So in this story, it's basically about a bunch of escaped science experiments, little kids. And the main character, one of the main characters, Tetsuo, he's in a biker gang and crashes into this little psychic kid, and then he suddenly awakens psychic powers. And the story basically is kind of tragic in the sense that it shows him progressing and gaining these amazing telekinetic abilities and ability to manipulate the environment. But instead of truly transforming his consciousness, he's just inflating his ego. He's doing whatever the hell he wants, And they kind of, again, they analogize this idea that, your friend Tetsuo, he's got a problem in the same way a bacteria, if it suddenly gained the powers of a human mind, would just be inflated and do whatever it wanted and completely disrupt its level of the ecosystem. So to me, anyway, just to kind of throw this in here, this is a very interesting analogy for the mental rational to the integral, in the sense that we have gained these enormous powers of time, of the manipulation of the environment. We have gained an enormous intensification of consciousness, but we're still kind of expressing that through the mental and in this kind of inflated way. So yeah, the leap is actually a leap into a singularity, an infinite horizon point, rather than a self-continuing aggrandizement or extension of the human ego. Tetsuo must become more, or perhaps there's an aspect of his nature that is that something. Akira is interesting because Akira is the name of the film, but the protagonist is called Tetsuo. Akira was a previous experiment who is now dormant, stored away in this underground chamber in the laboratories, and he's literally been dissected, and almost like an interesting, like a mummy or something. His organs are in these vials, all slayed apart. And towards the end of the film, Akira has to reconstitute and save Tetsuo and stop him from destroying the world, which for me anyway is kind of an interesting, talks about integration, of course, and stasis. And Akira seems to have something that Tetsuo doesn't, but I'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so Akira moves in with the rest of his other psychic children and takes Tetsuo into a new universe at the end of the film, likely saving our own from being destroyed by its birth. Or perhaps Tetsuo himself realizes a kind of godhead consciousness or originary mind and gives birth to a new reality. Now, I think I'll play the clip. One where perhaps his previous human form is nothing but a bit of cosmic dust in some new galactic expanse. And who is Akira? We know from the manga he becomes a kind of religious leader, and the film itself frames his character as a kind of prophetic figure, an avatar who would renew the world. Akira is something like a technological Osiris, his body cut up into bits and placed in medical urns to be studied and turned over and over by the scientists that initially unleashed his powers into the world. But Akira is not dead. His consciousness appears to be able to reconstitute itself and reassemble the parts just in the nick of time to save Tetsuo. Unlike Tetsuo, Akira seems to understand the limitations of approaching this new consciousness with the mind frame of the human ego. Akira has concretized origin and realized time, reconstituting himself in an A-wearing leap. One could interpret the backdrop of Neo-Tokyo and Tetsuo synonymously with the limitations of human consciousness, swelling up with some intensification, some latency wishing to be born in the process of becoming realized in certain young children. The massive sprawling city is an iconic image for the cyberpunk genre, alongside other great anime films, Ghost in the Shell or Blade Runner in 1981. It represents, as mentioned earlier, the zenith of human achievement, the very limits of the human as it so transforms this environment so as to no longer resemble anything organic. Toward the end of the film, and let me see if I can actually, I don't know. Load? No. Let me see if I can Say this without messing up my live stream. This is the end of the talk here.
Can you do both simultaneously?
I'm gonna try.
Yeah.
That's
very close.
It's very close.
We're in an inception.
Let's see, does that work?
Yeah, it's.
These ellipses.
I like that word you use.
Okay, volume, yes.
Is there volume?
You won't be able to
Yeah,
control.
there is.
Okay, no, there's.
It's full screen it.
Okay, yeah, let me see if I can do that.
That's the fear moment. There it is.
More,
There we go.
more volume.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm just gonna let it play silently so you can kind of see. This is the end of the film where he's being confronted by all of his friends and buddies, and he loses an arm. And I'll just kind of read here.
That's Tetsuo.
Yeah, he loses an arm. That's his girlfriend in a fight, and he reconstitutes his arm out of bits of metal and debris. And he, kind of going like, I'm not limited by my form. I can become whatever I want. But he's slowly losing control over his powers. His powers are, as Gebser would say, does time, do we fulfill time or does time fulfill us? And he suddenly loses complete control, and his body becomes this expressive, terrifying body horror of organic and metallic things, as he's just unable to now control with his ego these unleashed powers, the singularity of the human. And that's I think it's Frank Akiba confronting him. And he thinks he's this badass guy, but he ends up needing to be saved by Akira. Let's see if I can add a little bit. Where he just becomes, and to me anyway, this kind of scary giant baby is sort of a great encapsulation of the mental rational right now. This is what we're doing to our environment. We've become so much more, we've unleashed more than what we are, and therefore we've unleashed ourselves. But we don't know the appropriate consciousness to meet that singularity, that intensity. We're trying with the mental, and it's just not working. It overcomes us, it overpowers us. We implode into ourselves. So to me anyway, this is more poignant in terms of consciousness studies and just sort of understanding that we need some kind of intensification of consciousness beyond the ego in order to really survive in the Anthropocene, to meet ourselves as this tremendous force, which is now on par with the environment. It's not our ego that's on par with the environment, it's something more. So if we can learn to adapt to that and survive that and not become a monster, that would be good. Interestingly, there's a body horror film called Tetsuo, the Iron Man. I think it's named after him. It's a good Japanese film. Very creepy. It's very, very spooky. Let's see if there's anything else. Just what I've been saying. One can't help but make comparisons of this last scene to John Gebser's own descriptions of the failures of the mental rational to truly conquer and master time. Instead, time masters humankind. In the last scene, Tetsuo and Neo-Tokyo represent the zenith of mental rational consciousness, inflated by its own deficient attempt to harness the powers of origin, imploding upon said singularity. And the film begins at the ending. The film ends at the beginning, at the singularity of originary consciousness itself, perhaps the only level of mind capable of harnessing the powers we have unleashed from ourselves. And let me see if I can just skip ahead. Eventually, Akira shows up and says, all right, let's take you out of this universe. And gosh, I wish I could play the audio because the singularity happens, just expanding, and then it sort of takes him in, and then you hear, I think it's Tetsuo say, I am. And then all of a sudden you see the birth of this new cosmos that they pulled him through right in the nick of time and helped him create. So it's interesting because it's not the ego that's doing this, of course, it's something else about us. But okay, so that's really it. That's my presentation. I wanted to get to that. So thank you.
Lydia, let's just take time for questions that are needed, right? We made such a long trip to come here. Don't worry about being chased down by time.
had two insights. I'll start backwards. So Tetsuo means iron. That's why it's called Tetsuo Iron Man, the other film you mentioned a bit and briefly. But I was thinking about how iron is in blood, but also steel, and we have this idea of that, like, destruction and the merging with the city, this kind of character that's got this completely sort of not human sense in a way, you know, like that just around his name, iron.
They were floated in it all world.
Right, yeah, this metallic as opposed to the organic side of the chemistry periodic table. And then when you talked about annihilation, she's looking at this starfish and it's incomprehensible, and she loses sight of the horizon between sea and sky. And then she says, this shining beacon below me, but traditionally stars are shining beacons above. So you have this integration of the stellar with the biological that's giving you this complete disorientation when she loses the ego and integrates into that environment. So the fact that she chose to write, or that she was observing a starfish and not like a shrimp or something else is also an interesting choice.
Thank you.
She actually, when you were talking about bacteria and having the mind of a human, she mentioned cancer. She brought that up. Before she even saw it, she actually was out of the room for your clip, but if she had seen it, I think she would have seen how prescient her comment was about cancer, because the idea is at the end, Akira, or I should say Tetsuo, actually becomes like cancerous. Like his embodiment of this consciousness is cancerous and becomes, and that, as you were saying, that's like pretty much the expression of the mental rational right now, and also trying to figure out and get into this like more integral consciousness. There's this deficiency, but I think something you missed, and you might not have picked up on it in the original movie, it's sort of subtle. Akira is actually, at the very beginning, the person who destroys Tokyo. It's not a nuclear explosion, and it's kind of a twist at the end, so I'm sorry we're in the movie. But Akira's initial burst into consciousness is what destroys Tokyo. So I'm very, very like not good at Gebser, so I'm just going to say like this, the society before is destroyed initially by Akira. So the initial like portal into this integral consciousness is destroys like the kind of the efficient aspect of Tokyo and that sort of thing. And then it's new Tokyo and it's like deficient, it's like all messed up. And then Tetsuo comes and like almost destroys that. But then at the end, there's this whole new universe that is created. And it's almost like humanity is left behind a little bit because it's this whole new universe was birthed by humans in a way, a human consciousness, but now it's gone beyond the realm of humans. So we're not all going into it really. It's sort of like we just gave birth to it and it's something new. But I would really recommend anime. I feel like I did a little bit of studies in Japanese cultural studies, a little bit in college. Anime is like one of those things where there's a lot of depth of thought, and if any of you as intellectuals or academics haven't thought about exploring anime as like really serious film and really serious subjects to really like explore and think deeply on, I would really encourage you to like find a list online of anime that are considered classics and really look at it from like an intellectual, like a critical standpoint. You'll be very surprised by what you find as Jer presented here. So.
One quick note on that. Yeah, I was going to also suggest Ghost in the Shell, which came out a few years after, which is really interesting kind of commentary on internet and consciousness and evolution. There's similar themes. Anime is adult. It's adult film, not adult films, but
sometimes
they're very complex. They're not really fun cartoony things for kids. They are adult themes, interesting messages, experimental film. It's great. If you haven't checked that out, I would recommend. But yeah, your point about Akira at the beginning, that's just a really good point, that it happened before, and Akira's already been through this implosion, and he's able to kind of help Tetsuo go like, hey, let me stop you and get you out of here so you don't repeat the same mistakes. Also, an interesting note about the film, Akira,
I was just thinking about Art Lecter. All of this has happened before.
Yeah, that's another one we could talk about. But Akira, I forgot to mention this here, but Tetsuo is drawn to Akira throughout the whole film. He wants to meet him. He wants to find him. He's blowing up army bases to try to find where Akira is. He's called to Akira, which is a kind of interesting sort of a pull towards a singularity that's already occurred, and perhaps his own origin. He feels something about Akira that's like himself.
Yeah, just another comment following up on hers. This Tetsuo, so Iron Man, literally, it's got another pun that works in your favor. This Tetsu Iron is also the root of the word for philosophy, the study of iron. So Tetsuo would be someone who is of philosophy, but it would be a very Tetsuo version of philosophy. It's a very perspectival iron correlationist, to go back to Morton's sense of philosophy.
Yeah.
And he's going back to Akira. Of course, this is philosophy's failing. It won't allow itself to come apart. It wants to bring everything into itself.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, my understanding of Tetsuo is a wise, clear thinking. And you're saying Iron Man, so.
It's a pun because
both.
Tetsuo is not considered a bad term, it's a really good term. But
Yeah.
this film is questioning that.
Yeah.
When you say perspectival, is in like it takes a position as opposed to being not.
Just in the Gebserian sense, that's all I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, because astrologically, iron is related to Mars, which is something that definitely takes a position to the detriment of other positions. And so it is a destructive force.
Well, that would work well also.
Yeah,
Friendly force.
which is,
Okay.
More images from this Tetsuo the Iron Man. So just kind of playing a bit of film here. But yeah, any other questions, comments?
You said he was seeking origin, seeking.
That was my interpretation
Yeah,
of it.
that's very interesting.
Well, I think just from a global perspective, I think science fiction and Morton help kind of answer or start answering the question of when you read Gebser, you're going, okay, now what do I do? Or how do I get there? How do I start thinking differently? I think both of those try to sort through the transparency to kind of wash away the illusions of how and what we think is real and what we think are the foundations. And I think, so both of those, I think, help in that process.
Definitely, and I think science fiction is just a great place to look. You know, anime, books, there's a whole bunch of other stories and short stories and science fiction that I didn't list here that also explore these things, like All the Birds in the Sky, even apocalyptic literature, as sort of reified as that is as an event. It's still kind of interesting. It still explores kind of existential questions of how to live in a world that has been destroyed, how to go forward, how to keep birthing new generations in art and culture and so on.
Just a kind of thought or observation, maybe not a very useful one, because this is all very new to me, super interesting, but really new to me. So that kind of breaking down of the outer boundaries and expanding beyond, it seems really kind of pathological in these kind of images, right? But it makes me think also of Ishmael Reed, of the virus, the title just suddenly escaped me, but the Just Grew virus, that is this virus that is shared and it becomes a way for people to reconnect with the history that's kind of hidden from them. And it's a similar kind of breaking down of boundaries, but it has a kind of positive effect that suddenly people can have an understanding of something that's really hidden. So I don't know if there's a connection there or not, just something that occurred to me.
I think everybody's touching, I'm sorry.
Oh, please.
I apologize. I think everybody's just starting to touch on this, and maybe next year it's something we can talk about, is the way that the imaginary or the imaginal or the imagining, that's the eruption of that, what's breaking through as the orientation of human environment that would be distinct from the mental rational, how that's having the way in which it's being used, for instance, in corporate branding and the rise of Google capital. It has a lot of really pathological functions, and that we see all around us. So what we are all looking forward to in the integral, my wonderful Zen notion of interdependent being and orientating ourselves in this way where we're grasping our codependence and honoring it, has this a compatriot side to it that has to do with, I mean, Nishitani refers to this at the end of the imaginary breaking through as evil, and I think that's the word he uses. And the way in which we see these huge entities sort of seducing, and that's why I'm not certain about whether or not the end of persuasion, moving into seduction, is so wonderful. Because when we move into seduction, we start moving into the place where we're the colonization of the imagination, which is what's happening. And so maybe it seems to be happening all at once.
Well, it's kind of symbiotic in the sense that, when Margulis talks about one organism tries to eat the other, it ends up swallowing it, the organism survives and now becomes integral to that, like mitochondria. So yeah, we're trying to colonize it, but it's also colonizing us. So it's an interesting. It's an interesting.
Right. No, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy. I have to compliment the organizers. It looks like this is really a perfect presentation, and the end is sort of pulling things together for me. The imaginary is the mediation between what I call real and true, and the imaginary is becoming the transparency of, like famous use Gebser's notion, that is actually in the very core of a time or a period that we call transmodernity. There are a lot of people think we're still living in postmodern. Postmodern is gone a long time ago. And I can make argument that even postmodern and modern are really almost in a way the same with deviations. So we don't live in postmodern anymore, and we don't want to accept the transmodernity. In fact, transparency, transmodernity, transdisciplinary, etc., etc. It's really urging us to go beyond the absoluteness that I was talking about, to go beyond that, to reach even and to see through and go beyond. That's what transparency for me means. So, what she did. I missed you.
She relocated.
So when Lisa was talking about the imaginary, I don't know what she was talking about, because in fact I was thinking about Semiotic Society of America. This is great. I was going to propose to the people who do the program for Semiotic Society of America next year, the imagination and the imaginary. And now I'm thinking maybe there is something about transmodernity itself. Not trying to push something here. I'm trying to sell Gebser to semioticians. I'm trying to sell pills to Gebserians. So I really, we have to move beyond postmodern into what we call now transmodern. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to take this chance and thank you all. You made me feel at home. I feel like I have known every one of you for years, really, most of the people that I talk with. I am in Seattle, live north of Seattle, and I need to run to catch my ferry.
Okay.
I'm glad that I attend your lecture today.
Thanks so much.
Jeremy, one thing I think that a rubric that has not come up this weekend, but one we should at least register is capital. And we have spoken about economics and Peter Pagani, and that's important. But how does capital weave through all of this? Because capital does weave through it all. Yes. And how is that going to work?
It's a good subject maybe for next year as we're describing transparency.
Absolutely.
Perhaps as the theme, but transparency is a theme that's actually being used in economics now with platform cooperativism and these kind of distributed networks, and this idea that We need to sort of rethink and decentralize our economic models to be more resilient, have the semblance of natural ecosystems. Okay. But yeah, it's a great subject. It definitely feeds into the Anthropocene and what we're doing. Is there any other last questions before we?
Just a short one. Do you personally feel the physical apocalypse is going to be necessary before we get into the internet? So you seem to be playing with it a lot.
I think that I don't think it's necessary, but I do think it's really up to us in a very immediate way that we can choose to make this as difficult as we want or not. As Tetsuo, he's wrestling with it. He succumbed almost to it, but he got by. So I'm hoping we're going to get by, and I don't see us needing to have some kind of jackpot event over the century. I see it happening, but I'm just hoping that our kind of response is going to be quicker.
Okay, thank you.
Kind of on a very similar note, and perhaps this sounds a little young, naive, or hopeful, but to me, it seems like Tetsuo and Kira, I'm saying that right, they seem to have two similarities for it to be coincidental, and to me, you could almost interpret it as there are two reflections of the same being, of the same event. Perhaps you could even stretch it so far as to be an interpretation of while the mental rational is conceiving our reality currently.
That's good. There are two different experiences of the same event. I like that's really good.
Perhaps simultaneously kind of referencing an idea you already presented, that a perspective of a historical event or something that happens over time isn't clear to us while we're involved in it. Perhaps Kira represents the flip side, which is that the birth of the Aperspectival has already begun with the consumption of reality.
That's a great. No, I agree in terms of what you mentioned earlier on, that there was already a singularity, and so maybe the singularity between Tetsuo and Akira is the same, and that's why he feels so drawn to him the whole time. There's a likeness in Akira that Tetsuo feels that he already has, and maybe who knows? Maybe Tetsuo helped Akira reconstitute. I don't know. But, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would just say, in regards to Glenn's question about whether or not there has to be an apocalypse, I mean, basically yes, because, but I think we're thinking about it the wrong way, like you were mentioning. There's like this idea that you have to, that it has to be a sudden event, but it doesn't. But all of these structures we put in place for the mental rational, all of these things have to come down, basically, like the way that we do law, as he was talking about, the way we think about our societies, the way we think about our relationships to each other. So all of that has to be destroyed. So in that sense, yes, it's an apocalypse.
Yeah, you were talking about the possibility of tweaking our economic system, and I thought of one. I mean, no, you can't. I mean, so that make it sustainable. No.
Apocalypse really means revelation.
I was just gonna say.
But the thing is, like, if you think about it, for every baby that's born, their birth is the apocalypse, the end of their world. And then, but there's something new afterwards. So yes, in essence, whenever something ends, it has to end. So whatever we're doing now, yeah, we have to get rid of probably all of it in slow, incremental things that we don't, like you were saying, we don't notice while it's around us, and it's already happening. But I don't think once we're out of it, we'll be like, oh, that was the apocalypse. I was like, oh, who knew? But
Jeremy made a very, very wise statement. When we're in the moment, we don't see the change. You need time and perspective and distance with the mind, to see the change. Yeah. And then how much of the change are we creating on reflection?
Yeah.
And so this mirroring and reciprocation is really interesting. You made two statements that really I'm going to take home. Do we fulfill time, or does time fulfill us?
I think that's really, really critical in learning how to just like not be so imprisoned by language, which is the instrument of the mind. And this idea of the environment, we need to meet ourselves on the level of the environment. That's really where we're gonna start meeting ourselves, is when Ontology was saying how the limits of how much environment can sustain us have been surpassed, right? And so, but we're still taking, we become monstrous. We're gonna have to look at our monstrosity very soon. And that recognition with the human monster reflected back to us from the lack of, from the cutoff of resources is really key.
We will encounter ourselves.
But the starfish, and just, encountering this uncanny starfish, and suddenly encountering our own uncanniness.
And these ways that environment and human are mutating. We are mutating each other. Microbiology coming in here, mutating me, and me mutating my plants in my garden through my discharge into the garden.
Yeah, but if the mask that you wear, as I saw in China, has a pretty, like, kitten motif, then venturing out into the air so polluted that it leaves metallic dew on your windowsill isn't so bad, because you got the kitten. Right? And I mean, that's the problem, is that we can see it unfold, but we're putting the kitten mask on. Or we're saying, we know that we don't have any arable land, but this indigenous population somewhere else does, so we'll just take theirs. And so we've been able to sort of postpone this.
We're postponing, but we're reaching those limits too.
We are. We definitely are.
Remember too that we talk these things about how we impose ourselves, we influence our environment as something else, some kind of negative thing that we should do. We can't not do it. I mean, the Anthropocene starts out with the fact that human beings are migratory. We're talking 10,000 years ago, and it has to do with agriculture itself. I mean, these things, far more than we think now of emitting carbon emissions. I mean, there's the way in which we've conditioned and influenced and changed a self and surrounding environment is way, way, way previous to carbon emissions and far more profound. And so, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm lost my track. I guess I want to go back to Bookchin's first and second nature, that, our programs, our developments, the theoretical systems, the political systems, and economic systems, and social systems are all evolutionary organisms. And they in turn condition the biological evolutionary organisms, which in turn condition us. And when we recognize that, then Bookchin talks about moving into another stage that he calls free nature, in which that mutual conditioning is understood to be accepted as a fact of our vulnerability. That's our affectability. That's what we're trying to deny. That is our death, our life, the fact that our vulnerability, our pores are open. And so we recognize that, and then we can move into a different way of behaving in that context. And maybe, so that's what I think individuality has to do. I don't know why I had that little.
Thank you for that. Thank you. It's interesting because, I mean, with this whole human/natural, we wouldn't make that distinction anymore with, let's say, trees and the rise of trees and now plant life and photosynthesis.
The age of the
There's
tree.
no way that actually you can determine where the tree begins and you stop and vice versa.
That's right.
We are so integral to everything already.
But it's everything already.
And the Anthropocene is just sort of showing us that, as Tim Morton says, in this negative, catastrophic form. We're part of everything, and we're impacted.
What Bookchin says is the actual problem is hierarchical thinking. And just in terms of imagining these hierarchies. I don't know, I'm just reading it, I'm just fascinated by it.
So, I'm gonna try to think through this, what we've just been talking about. We are born we, humanity, humans, nurtured by Pachamama. Nature is taking care of us to get us to a maturity. We come to this place where we come to the end of limits, the end of the mental rational. We experience apocalypse. We come through it, apocalypse, as the revelation, also translated as the unveiling, transparency, a diaphany. We come through that into this diaphanous space, realizing that we are nature as one. And now, instead of nature nurturing us, we must nurture nature to bring it back into some semblance of something that can sustain the whole, because we are that.
That's an interesting question.
Well, that's the old way. I mean, we always talked about tending the garden, right?
Yeah.
We were caretakers.
But now,
And
where
that's
does
lost.
the garden begin and end?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's long lost.
Or what's
Mother
the
Nature is
fruit
in
of
a
the
nursing
garden?
home. Mother Nature is in a nursing home.
Yeah.
I mean, you know,
Yeah.
our parents.
I think when you say where do we begin and where do we end, that speaks directly to that idea of the law, the changing idea of the law, that we have a system in effect where the law supports economics, it supports me as an individual, hoarding my fortunes, saving them as though I am permanent and for always, but saying that that relationship that's artificial is wrong, then you start to break down that barrier.
Yeah.
Legislation.
Legislation has to begin to reflect these insights.
Right.
I think the crux of that as well is property. This idea of this unnatural accumulation, like you think of it, your American dream, your house and the things you own, and you keep accumulating. Nothing in nature really accumulates like that. We have natural disaster, but
We've just got full circle to Dr. Wirth's opening.
Yeah.
Wow, the end is the beginning.
Very full circle.
Perhaps we should move on to the next part of our day, which is a nice stroll through the city. Show. So thank you, everybody. Oh yeah, bathroom break, I guess.
Yeah, bathroom
Couple
break,
minutes.
please.
There are, just for your knowledge, there are some books here. We have a few copies of the Diaspora Journal, which is the Gebser Society Journal. If you're interested in reading a copy, just speak to Jen right there, or me.
Beautiful.